Hello everyone. I have just read the prologue to Coruscant Nights 2, Street of Shadows. Um, this was a little bit confusing to start off with until page 2, and then I had to quickly go back and skim through the first page because it was not made clear which character's perspective it was from, and based on the language, it sounded like it was Vader. And then he turns out to be Captain Typho, Gregor Typho. Now, I actually want to briefly bring up something before we get completely into this chapter. Um, I have actually been trying to remember bits of Last of the Jedi Death on Naboo. Um, and for some reason, I just can't remember the bits with Typho. I remember him having some involvement in there, but I do not remember much. Um, So I think that I checked Wikipedia. Apparently, he helped fight off the Empire, which sounds about right. Um, but I really do not remember much about Typho's involvement in the book. And I also am for some reason struggling to remember how, because I know in those books it was brought up that Padme, that there was a false account of how Padme had died, and that was presented publicly, and Malorum, of course, knew that was a false account and was trying to find out what had really happened to her, and I, for some reason, cannot remember that account of what had happened. Um, so I'm trying to remember, it's not coming to mind. I'm not going to get the book at the moment because the way way I have my books arranged at the moment, I do not have a bookshelf. So at the moment they're currently on the shelf and they're stacked upwards. So to get to that book, I'd have to take quite a few books. I'd have to take about 6 books down, 6, 7 books down, before I could actually get to that book. So I'm not gonna do that. Anyway, let's get to the prologue. So here we're told about how Typho has loved Padme, and Padme had never known. He thinks about how Mustafar had been a really awful place for her to die. Pardon me. Um, and that, uh, what was it? And that she had apparently gone on a mission that was so important, even her bodyguards couldn't come. And we just told about how much Typho is grieving, how much he's misses Padme, how much he keeps hitting himself for not, well, not physically, but metaphorically hitting himself for not being there when she needs to protect her. How he's trying to figure out what he could have done differently to protect her, etc. And he's just very grief stricken. He's very grief stricken. I mean, it's thought of that even had she lived, there would have been no chance that they would have gotten together because I assume Typho is one of the ones that was kept. I assume Typho just didn't know about Anakin being married to Padme, based on how it's said. I assume maybe some were told, like Padme's family, for example, but I would have thought Typho probably would have known, but no, apparently it doesn't, that Anakin was married to Padme. Um, and we're told that even had Padme lived, there was very little chance they would have gotten together anyway. Um, and then he thinks that he's got to stop wallowing in his sadness, and Padme would want it like that. And then he says, but first, he must avenge Padme. And then we're told that he had seen some of the reports, and we're told that well, the government officials and factums factosums or whatever it was, are busy, of course, having to manage not Padme, Naboo's autonomy in the Galactic Empire, where they're trying to take over. But with all that to Typho, that's less important than his love for Padme, um, and he starts thinking because being high ranks, he's a little bit more in the loop on what has happened to Padme. Um, and he knows that she had been strangled to death and that the child did not survive. Again, they only thought there was one child, so that's actually a really neat thing. That's I know it's even said in the movies that it's a shock that she had twins, but it's a neat thing to kind of remember that. Because I think that's an easy thing to forget that they may have not that they do know she had twins until literally moments before her death. But he was told about how he had seen her the autopsy and how there had been great damage inside, how there had been a lot of damage inside her. There was no damage on her neck or throat. There was no outside damage. And he only knows one way that could have happened, and it's through the Force. That's the only way she could have been strangled without being physically grabbed. And he thinks back to Padme going after Anakin. And of course now he wants to get revenge. Well, he wants to avenge her. And we're told that even if Anakin wasn't the culprit, the one who killed her, even though we know that he technically did, we know that he knows that Anakin will probably know, and he thinks that he has to find him. And that will decide, and that would decide when, and he'll decide whether he's worth being kept alive or whether he's worth dying, or whether he's worth to be killed. And then we're told, and that maybe then Padme can rest easier, and that's where we end the prologue. This chapter was you really see how Typho is again just so grief stricken, and I think this chapter did a really good job of just showing how devastated he is. I think if I had one big problem with this chapter though, it's just it didn't clarify what the perspective was until the next page, until the second page, and for the entire time, I thought he was talking about Anakin until it brought up Typho, and I read a bit of page 2, and I still thought page 1 was on Anakin until I realised maybe it's talking about Typho when it said when it was talking about Typho's love for Padme. That's when I realised, oh, it was the first page on Typho. So I went back, skimmed through it, and everything started to make a lot more sense, because before page 1 didn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think it just needed to much sooner make it clear that it was Typho they were talking about, rather than it being, and just because I thought it was talking about Anakin and his grief. I didn't read the preview, which includes the prologue that's in the first book. I didn't read the preview in the first book, but the prologue is for the second book is in the first Coruscant Nights book. It's in Jedi Twilight, and I saw again the first page of the prologue in there. I didn't read it. But I did have a quick look, and it did seem like that it was gonna be um it did seem like it was going to be focused on Vader, and I was completely under the impression this was from Anakin's perspective, not Typho. So that's one problem I have with this chapter. But I think this did a good job of just showing how much grief Typho has, and you really sympathise with him. Um, One concern I do have going into this book and the next book, um, again, is if we started to introduce too many characters. We've already got a lot of characters from the first book on our hands. I think there's going to be quite a few more characters that are going to be coming, in this book and the next book, that we're going to be focusing on. And I don't, and it's particularly Labyrinth. She is in particular going to need a lot more development. I think she's a fine character as she is. She's got she has some outstanding moments in the first book, but I do worry that. But she's the least developed main character in the first book. And I do worry that now that we're introducing Typho, I think we could maybe get away with only having Typho, but I think there's meant to be a couple more characters that are meant to join the main cast. Let's say main cast, you know what I mean, the main character, our main group, in these books, and it's how are we going to give all of them the time of day? Because I know Caird is going to be out the picture, I know Sheezor's out the picture, but we still have Jax, I5, Den, Labyrinth, um, Rahinian, and now that's 5, and now we have Typho, and there's probably going to be a couple more. That's loads of characters, and it does feel like there's how we need to kind of give all of them the time of day, and it just feels like, are we going to get a chance to give Labyrinth the time of day? Because unfortunately, she just didn't get a whole lot character-wise in the first book. And I like Labyrinth. I think, again, she's got some interesting things about her and and has an interesting, fighting style. Her fighting style is very interesting. Again, I was blown away in the first book, but I do hope we get a little bit more time with Labyrinth in this book. Just kind of develop how she is. Again, we don't need to go into her backstory, just involve her in conversations more. Have her be a little bit show us a little bit more of her personality, because at the moment she just doesn't feel like the deepest character. I mean, Jax, even though he started off quite rough in the first book, he develops quite a bit into a well-rounded character. Slowly he did, but it was eventually done by the end of the next book. And so I do hope that we're not going to that Labyrinth still has some time to develop in this book, or the next book. I do hope she gets a bit of time to develop. But I am going to be interested to see how much Typho's involved in this book. Hold on. Because it does seem like he's going to have quite a lot of it seems like he's going to have quite a lot of things going on that. I know he dies in this book. I'm going to say that now. But I'm going to be interested to see how his storyline goes. I just hope that, and I think there's a couple more main characters that will be coming in now, but I just hope none of them overshadow the other characters, because again, there's loads of new. Oh, I know Nick's out the picture as well, but there's loads of characters. There's loads of characters that we got at the moment, and we kind of need to give particularly Labyrinth the time of day. But yeah, I really enjoyed this chapter. I think it again just shows grief. It shows how it showed grief in such a good way, and it's kicked off an interesting plot line. I think though it does feel a little bit weird that the second book has a prologue, but the first book didn't. The first book kind of has like 2 prologues. You got the first 3 chapters, which is kind of like the prologue, and then you have chapters 4 to 10, which is like a second prologue. And so yeah, we kind of have a prologue in the first book, but there's nothing really official in the first book that's considered a prologue. And then you got book 2 as a prologue, and it feels a bit like, maybe this should have just been chapter 1. Maybe it should have just been chapter 1. and it would fit a little bit better. But anyway, I think that brings an end to this review. I do want to quickly check Padme's Wikipedia page though, see if it brings up anything surrounding her death. Okay, this is sourced from the original Battlefront 2, but I believe it is, I believe this is actually what was similarly said in the Master of the Jedi books, which was that a rogue Jedi killed her, on Coruscant. I think, yeah, that sounds about right. From what was said in the Master of the Jedi books, yeah, I think, yeah, that sounds about right. I think it was brought up in the fourth book, when Melora first arrives on the Naboo, that a rogue Jedi killed her, or just before, or when he's at Police Master. Which I think was like chapter 10 of that book, which is the shortest one of that book. I think in the shortest chapter in the entirety of Last of the Jedi, I think. But yeah, that sounds about right. She died to a rogue Jedi. That was what was publicly released, I think. So in the lore, I think that's what it was. So yeah, that sounds about right. It's source against source Battlefront 2, but I'm fairly sure Death on Naboo included that. So yeah. Anyway, that brings an end to this review. So thank you all for watching, and goodbye.